Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. My name is sabrinasalvati. My special guest tonight is Chris Hedges. He is a journalist and author, and he's the host of the Chris Hedges Report on the Real News Network. Welcome back, Chris. Thanks so much for coming on.
Sure. Thanks, Sabrina.
So I want to start off with post-midterm election results. We saw that we didn't really have a red wave, so to speak, which was expected to happen. But the Democrats did lose the House. I noticed there was a lot of focus from the Democratic Party on these Senate seats per se. And at the same time, they ended up losing the House, which means that a lot of this legislation, especially progressive legislation, is probably not going to get a chance to get through. And I wanted to hear from you about that. Why do you feel the Democrats lost the House, but not so much the Senate?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's be clear that the Republican Party is probably the worst political party in American history, filled with cranks and conspiracy theorists and Trump cult-like followers. So the fact that the Democratic Party can't swamp them should be disturbing. We have a couple of senators in the Senate who are Democrat only in name. They regularly vote against Democratic policies. Although there was some progressive legislation passed to the House, it was all killed effectively in the Senate, including we saw with the railroad strike, the bill to allow 7 paid days of sick leave was killed in the House. So I think it's just part of the political stagnation that was true before the midterms and is true after the midterms. And that stagnation is very difficult. Almost none of the promises that the Biden administration made when it was running for the presidency have come to fruition, whether that's the Build Back Better bill, paid family leave, $15 minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that stagnation, especially with inflation eating away at American incomes, I think it's 64% or something of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck and could not cover a minor emergency of a few $100s. That feeds the kind of proto-fascist movement that gave rise to Trump and that fuels the following behind figures like DeSantis and others.
Speaking of that, I did see a poll recently that Ron DeSantis has now passed Donald Trump, and I'm a little bit, concerned about that because I actually think Ron DeSantis is worse than Donald Trump. He was a JAG officer. I found out recently about his time at Guantanamo Bay, which I did not know about for a long time. I think he's actually going to be worse. So there's this perception that a lot of the Trump base has moved away from Trump. I actually don't believe that. I think he still has a strong base, but I see some of those people moving towards Ron DeSantis, who I think could be even worse. And I want to get your opinion about that. If Ron DeSantis were to run in 2024, if he got the Republican nomination and he ran in 2024 and Joe Biden again is the nominee for the Democratic Party, do you think that someone like Ron DeSantis could win because of the failures of the Democratic Party and them not supporting the working class?
Yeah, that's my biggest fear. And at that point, these forces are going to snuff out what's left of our very anemic democracy. And I agree with you. A figure like DeSantis is far more dangerous than Trump because he's competent. Trump is a moron and impulsive and disorganized, and but that's not true for DeSantis or for Tom Cotton or Pompeo or others. All three of them, by the way, come out of the military.
Right. And Ron DeSantis, to me, he seems to be a little bit more professional, and he puts on a good face. I think he's not as crass as Donald Trump was. And at the same time, I think that the Democratic Party has made a big mistake here, not supporting the working class. And it didn't just start with Joe Biden. This goes back, at least for me, for my generation, this goes back to Obama, right? just forgetting about the workers, I think the railroad strike was a big reveal for a lot of people. A lot of people I have spoken to are very upset. I did speak to the railroad workers on this show. They are also, as you can imagine, very upset, not happy with the way that things turned out. And I want to get your opinion about this in reference to the working class and the Democratic Party. What I
Yeah,
have
well, the Democratic Party, again, while Biden was campaigning, they all promised to push through a bill to strengthen collective bargaining, and then threatened with a railroad strike. They revoked the possibility of collective bargaining for one of the very few entities, railroad workers, that retained it.
Right.
They forced railroad workers to accept a contract that over 50% had already rejected. So, yeah, the Democratic Party is long on rhetoric, but solidly behind the corporate oligarchy that has carried out the coup d'etat, in essence, that seized control of both parties and seized power. And that fundamentally is the problem. We see it with the war industry. The only opposition to this endless funding of weaponry that's going into Ukraine comes from largely cranks and conspiracy theorists in the Republican Party. The 100 members of the Progressive Caucus, including Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and they all vote for war. This staggering new Pentagon budget, $853 billion, which is more than the Pentagon asked for, actually. And they're going to supplement that with another $21 billion for Ukraine. I mean, and that's how empires die. It's unchecked, unregulated militarism that hollows the country out from the inside. So we spend these staggering sums for military adventurism around the globe, while our bridges collapse and our schools are crumbling, and we can't even get teachers to teach in the schools because the teaching conditions are so poor and the salaries are so low. Roads, infrastructures going, the rail network is, something out of Bolivia. I don't want to slam Bolivia, I used to live in Bolivia, but there's no restraint now, and both parties. I mean, the Democratic Party, at least if you look at the votes in Congress, is more fervently a war party than the Republicans.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've seen happen too, which is also concerning, on my call-in show, I'm not sure if you're familiar with call-in, but it's a new app where people can call into the show. On my call-in show, people have called in and they've said that because of the things that they've seen happen with the Democratic Party, particularly this situation with the rail workers, that they now believe because of some of the politicians in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, voted for the 7 day sick days for leave. Because they voted for that, they now believe that the Republican Party is now the party for the working class. And I'm trying to explain to them, like, guys, no, you don't understand. This is all theater. They already knew the 7 days wasn't going to pass in the Senate. So I don't want you to have this perception that the Republican Party is now for the working class. They're both serving the same masters here. But that's the problem we're running into now, is because of the way the Democratic Party has treated the working class. Now you have some people who are from the Bernie movement, who are liberal, saying that they're going to go join the Republican Party because they believe that they're the ones that are going to support the workers. And that's very concerning.
Well, that's a political infantilism if that's what they believe. This was the assault on the working class was bipartisan. It was Bill Clinton who transformed the Democratic Party into the Republican Party and then pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. But there's no daylight between Democrats and Republicans on all of the assaults, starting with NAFTA, destruction of welfare, the deregulation of the FCC, Glass-Steagall, all the trade deals, austerity programs. It was what they argue about are more politically tangential or cultural issues, but on the substantial issues that determine the direction of the country, there's very little difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. And of course, that is evidenced in the fact that they are both slavishly beholden to the Pentagon and the war industry.
That's right. How do you feel about the way that some of the progressive politicians voted in reference to the railroad workers? Like, we've been pretty vocal about that over here, and my comrades at RBN, we made it very clear that we don't care if it wasn't going to pass in the House. As a progressive, especially those that are members of DSA, they are not supposed to be strike breakers. Now, they came back with a lot of excuses. I've had this conversation with multiple people, but to me, you're supposed to stand by your principles. And what we've seen happen over time is these progressives that have gone into Congress, and it's not just the squad. I'm going back to someone like Nancy Pelosi, who at one point in time, she considered herself to be a progressive. I remember watching the video when Nancy Pelosi actually supported single payer health care, and now she doesn't support Medicare for all. Do you feel that this strategy of putting progressives to the Democratic Party, at least on the national level, do you feel this strategy is actually working, or should we be trying something different at this point?
No, it's clear evidence from the voting record that it doesn't work. The power of a Pelosi or a Schumer is that they funnel the money from Wall Street, from corporate America, into the coffers, campaign coffers of candidates, and they can snuff you out if you don't play by the rules, if you don't do what they say. This is what happened to Dennis Kucinich, who voted against all of the military budgets, brought in articles of impeachment against George W. Bush for the Iraq War. It was the Democratic Party in Ohio that gerrymandered his district to make sure he wouldn't win after, I think he served 8 terms in the House or something. And they know that they have a choice. Either they can pay lip service to progressive values, but that's irrelevant. I remember it was Kucinich who, when Obama was running for president, gave me a printout of Obama's voting record in the Senate. I think it was only for 2 years. And Kucinich said, you got to look at this. It's every corporate giveaway, supporting capital punishment. It's what they vote. It's not what they say. I mean, in Dennis being Dennis, said it was like when he was a kid in Cleveland going to the baseball games, the guys would go up and down the aisle going, get your scorecard, get your scorecard. He said, this is the scorecard. That's all that matters. I mean, that's why when Obama won, he won Advertising Age's Marketer of the Year. I mean, the professionals knew precisely what he had done. So it doesn't matter what they say. It matters what they do. And they're not, unfortunately, held accountable for what they do. The only way is to build movements that create pressure. Grassroots movements, unions are, of course, vital because they have the power of the strike. And those are the only way that elites respond. That's just been true throughout American history. It was all of the movements that opened up American democracy, which was very closed unless you were white, male, property owner, and at the beginning, most of them were slaveholders. This was why Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States is such an important book. He showed how those movements created a more democratic system, whether it was the abolitionists, the labor movement, and we had hundreds of American workers were killed. I just interviewed on my show Adam Hochschild, who wrote American Midnight, about that destruction of the left by Woodrow Wilson, especially after World War I. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement. These are the only mechanisms we have in order to pressure power. And most of them have quite systematically been stripped from us, starting in the early 70s, and the Lewis Powell memo, of course, being the kind of blueprint for that. I think we have about 10% or something of the U.S. workforce is unionized. That's it. And even those who are unionized, like the railroad workers, have been stripped of the one weapon they have to force their demands and protect their working conditions and their pay, and that's the strike. Take that away, and they're impotent. They can't affect power at all. And that's what we just witnessed. And it was the Democrats who did it to them.
That's right. One of the things I know they were trying to do too is that they wanted to make the railroad public and not have it privatized as well. We always tell people that, you know, unions are a great start, but we really like push people to take that extra step if they can for worker co-op so they can have somewhat of ownership of the company. Because I've seen in the past too, like some of the union leaders will turn on the union members and not like put forth what the union members actually voted on. They'll do what's best for their spot and what's best for management. And some of those union leaders, they're making like six figures. So I've seen them kind of betray the workers too sometimes. But we try to push for people to go that extra step to start a worker co-op if they can. I understand that there's all kind of money involved in that as well, and not everybody can do that. But you have to give people something here. And I think what really woke me up about the railroad workers is like, wow, we really don't own anything. We really don't. It's like they could just come in and just break this up and say, no, I'm sorry, you can't go forward with this. And in reference to movements, I want to get your opinion about what we can do on the local level, because I saw your interview with Ralph Nader, and I agree with what he was saying that we need to be organizing with people in our community. So that's something that we heavily promote. We do mutual aid, but also when it comes to electoral politics, I've seen some of these progressive policies pass on the local level. Now, I'm in a ballot initiative state. So in Massachusetts, we've put forth like some of these policies that Bernie Sanders ran on. Like we passed $15 minimum wage years ago. We put forth the millionaire tax, which passed this year. So there's a couple of things that have gone through. Every time it doesn't win, you know, ranked choice voting didn't pass because people didn't understand the question. But what we've seen is that even in the red states, Chris, progressive policies are passing. South Dakota passed Medicaid expansion. Nebraska passed $15 minimum wage. And I want to get your opinion about that. Do you think this could be the way to move forward in reference to electoral politics, working on the local level instead?
Yeah, I think that's where it begins. I mean, this has been part of the failing of the Green Party, is that they would mount presidential candidates, but they didn't really build a base locally. I mean, they claimed that they did, but it never really worked. We see Shama Sawan and her party, Socialist Alternative, has been quite effective in terms of organizing. I just want to go back to a point you make about the railroads and public ownership, because what's happened with the railroads is that they've been seized by corporations and consolidated into just a handful of large corporate entities. And what they've done is, of course, shrink the workforce from about 540,000 railroad workers in 1980 to just 130,000 today. So there are now only 7, I think, Class 1 freight companies, and 4 of them control 83% of rail traffic. And Wall Street keeps squeezing them for more profits. And of course, the consequences of that is that the rail workers have horrific working conditions, in that they're always on call. Of course, they don't have paid sick time. It's because they're so skeletal, the crews, that the large corporation, they're running on such a slight margin of error that if not even a significant number of those people don't come to work, they can't run the rail lines. So I just want to say that what you said about public ownership, certainly breaking up monopolies, but ultimately public ownership is key. And those institutions that, like the post office, for instance, that was publicly owned, is increasingly being crushed. Services are being cut back. Salaries of postal workers are being slashed and replaced with temp workers. There's not only a concerted effort on the part of corporate power to prevent public ownership, but they're willfully destroying those public institutions, including the public school system, because it's all about privatization. It's all about profit. And then, of course, you see the rise of these charter schools, especially in poor neighborhoods, which are just military style, rote factories, that. So, there's this steady assault. I mean, of course, we have a for-profit healthcare industry, which proved disastrous in terms of containing the pandemic. I think we were 16% of the world's deaths were less than 4% of the world's population. And of course, we are an industrialized country that should have been able to handle the pandemic, but there's no centralized medical system. It's all profit based. Again, they've been closing hospitals, especially in rural areas that they feel are not profitable or not profitable enough, because it's not about healthcare, it's about profit. I mean, we live in a country where, in essence, it's legal for corporations to bankrupt parents as they desperately try and save their sons or daughters. I mean, it's the sickness of corporate greed and corporate cruelty is very, very advanced. And I think this goes back to the frustration and the anger and the rage among the working class. And it's a legitimate rage. Unfortunately, the white working class tends to express it in very self-destructive ways. It's kind of proto-fascism or Christian fascism. But the rage is legitimate. They have every right to hate what these slick-talking politicians, from Barack Obama to Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, have done to them.
The last question I have for you, come 2024, if the choices are Joe Biden and Trump, or a Trump-like figure, let's just go at Ron DeSantis, should people, given everything that has happened under Biden's presidency, do you feel that people should still vote for Joe Biden again, and why or why not?
Well, I mean, I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter. I have long tried to work to build third-party movements. We haven't gotten very far because the two parties conspire quite viciously against us. And in fact, the Democrats are worse. They challenged all of Nader's voting lists in courts to run up his legal bills. I think they got up to about $1 million or something, locking him out of the debates. So we're going to have to take that very grim and difficult step if we are going to actually build an alternative base. At the beginning, it's going to be hard. We're not going to get a lot of support. In fact, we're going to be vilified. But it's what we should have done a long, long time ago. I mean, Ralph never thought he would win. I mean, the Progressive Party, for instance, powerful political party at the turn of the century, never won, but it got big enough that it pressured, especially Teddy Roosevelt and others, to respond. Eugene V. Debs, who I think at the height got about 6% of the vote, again, frightened the Democrats. And that's what Ralph wanted, 5, 10, 15 million people to put pressure on the Democrats to begin to respond to the concerns and the rights and rectify the injustices. So I think it's only going to come from the grassroots. And it's of course, they're going to work overtime to demonize, as they have, all of us who step outside of the system and attempt to organize to push back. It's not done quickly. I mean, this is my frustration with Bernie Sanders, where he calls for a political revolution as if we're going to get a political revolution in an election cycle that ends with him telling us to vote for Hillary Clinton. Ain't going to work like that. Ain't going to happen. It doesn't happen that way. And, we've got to go back and look to our radical roots, the Wobblies, all of these great radical militant, the Communist Party, let's be frank, that has been written out of American history. We have to replicate their kind of organizing and their kind of militancy if we're going to wrest back control from these corporate oligarchs that are frankly destroying the country and flirting with a third world war.
That's right. And we see there's already an article out now from The Hill saying that anyone that pushes third parties should be side-eyed. So that's news for you guys there. But Chris,
I don't read
thank
that
you so
stuff. I
much.
just ignore it.
Yeah, I know. I know. I'm just giving you guys the heads up. That's already coming around the bank. But Chris, thank you so much for your time.
Sure, Sabrina. Yeah.
All
Thanks for doing it.
Bye.
Bye.